Okay. Today I want to talk about Soto Zen perspectives on healing. I came across a line in this book, Bringing Zen Home by Paula Arai. It's a practicing Zen Buddhist and a professor, I believe, at a university in Louisiana. And she's written this book, Bringing Zen Home, The Healing Heart of Japanese Women's Rituals. So I've been getting in and out of it, and I feel like there's a lot to be said about the Soto Zen perspective on what it means to be healed. It's not the same. Certainly, it's not the same from our secular understanding of what healing is. That you go to a doctor and you restore yourself to the way you were originally. And but there is connections with other forms, other religious traditions in terms of healing. The tradition that I grew up in, we heard many stories of the healing of, or of Jesus healing of lepers, raising Lazarus from the dead, restoring eyesight to the blind. The story that I think, the couple of stories there that I feel are interested and somewhat connected to Buddhist sense of healing. The man who was blind, you've heard that story in the Gospels? Man who is blind, and Jesus takes some soil from the ground and takes his saliva and mixes it with the soil and then rubs it on his eyes. I think that's so interesting. Even if you don't take it literally, it's an interesting story because it's so literally earthy. It's such a material-oriented kind of form of healing. It's not just saying prayers or something like that, which can be efficacious as well, but it's very grounded, using his own spit and rubbing it on a person's eyes. It's a very visceral sense of that. The story that I feel also has a lot of connection with Zen practice is when the woman who is hemorrhaging reaches out and touches the robes of Jesus, and all of a sudden her hemorrhage stops, and she's had this hemorrhage for, I don't know, months or years, constant flow, and touches his robes. And interestingly, he says, "I felt power go out of me." Who did this? And he turns and he sees, and he knows immediately who did it. But this idea of an exchange of energy. And in Asian thought, we talk about qi. The qi is energy. It's a life force. And in a sense, that's what we're doing when we are sitting in Zazen. We're cultivating qi. We're cultivating energy. The difference, and what we're doing is we're not necessarily keeping that energy for ourselves. I mean, it may affect us positively in some way, but the aim is not to collect it and to hoard it, but to release it out into the universe. So it's like gathering up of qi in a sense. I mean, this is just one way of considering our practice. And again, we're not trying to do this when we're sitting in meditation. It just happens. The more we sit, the energy kind of collects in our space, in the space that the physical space that we happen to be sitting in. My teacher shared a story when she was in Japan. She had a really bad headache, and she went to visit a temple, and she shared with the monk at the temple that she had this really bad headache. And he had several people over at this time. But he said, "Oh, okay, I can do something for you." So he took her in a side room and asked her to lay down, and he put his hand on her forehead, and she said that she could feel, it felt like needles moving into her head. And he did that for quite some time. I'm not sure exactly how long, but said, "I have to go, but I'll be back." He had guests that he needed to entertain. "I have to go, but I'll be back shortly to finish this because I'm not done." And she noticed already a difference in her headache that had diminished somewhat. And the monk returned. He had been drinking a little bit because that's what you do in Japan, and when you're entertaining people in many places. And he did the same thing again, putting his hand on her forehead, and she could tell the difference after he had been drinking that those pins and needles were not as strong as they had originally been. But she remembers feeling a difference, feeling better after having had that experience. Another story, again having to do with flow of energy, is when my teacher she was sewing. Sewing is a big practice in Zen Buddhism, sewing robes. These robes that we wear, many of us have sewn them ourselves. And she had been sewing, and one of the pins, to her unknowing, fell on the ground. And she had to get up from her seat quickly at one point to go into doing something else. She didn't have the presence of mind in that transition, and one of the needles that dropped on the floor, or one of the pins that dropped on the floor, actually got stuck into her big toe, the bottom of her big toe, the fat part, and she thought it was a bee that had stung her, and because she saw this bee flying around, and she didn't think anything of it, but just she had some pain there. Weeks went by, and she was starting to have trouble walking on her foot. And she was at a sesshin, a weekend retreat, intensive meditation, and one of the lay people that was there noticed how she was walking and called her back into a side room again, and said, "Hey, come here. There's something wrong with your gait. Let me look at your foot." And she, her toe is, I'm not sure what her toe looked like, but she burnt moksha. Have you heard of that, moksha? I just had it one time. It's kind of these. It's something that you burn and you place on your skin, and you burn, and it's supposed to have healing properties. So she placed moksha on her leg in certain spots, as well as massaging it, giving it a really vigorous massage. And then they had to return to the meditation retreat. And when they came back shortly after, she sat down. My teacher sat down, and she looked at the bottom of her foot, and she could almost feel like the energy flowing through her foot, and the needle or the pin that had gotten lodged in the underside of her big toe was coming out by itself. She could see it moving out from the big toe by itself. This is something that would have required in our country surgery, right? You would have to open up, but it had all to do with the flow of energy and a recognition, awareness of energy. The story I shared now, these are some stories of healing that, again, having to do with chi. Here's a story that I shared with you all before the event, before today. Yesterday, I sent you a link to the story of a woman who lost her child. How many of you got a chance to read that? Okay. All right. Good. Well, I'll share. I'll tell the story then. So, her name was Kisa, and Kisa had married, had a child, and shortly after, at some point in the marriage, her husband had died unexpectedly. She still had her son and or daughter, I'm not sure which. And the child succumbed to an illness and died. And she was grief-stricken about that, and was going around asking who could heal this child. Is there anybody you know that, going from one person to the other, please, going to various doctors. And finally somebody told her, you should go see the Buddha. He might have something to say to you about this. So she went to the Buddha and asked him, well, how can you heal my child? And the Buddha's response was, yes, but on the condition that you go to a house and ask for mustard seed. And the only way you can receive that mustard seed is if the household has never seen death. So she went out, based on the Buddha's instructions, she went to household after household, asking people for mustard seed. And they all came to her with mustard seed. And just before she was about to leave, she would say, oh yes, and it needs to be from a house that has never seen death. All of the houses she went to had seen death. Nobody in the houses there had not lost somebody that they'd loved. And so she was denied time and time again each house she went to. They had the mustard seed, but all of them had experienced death on some form. And after some time of having done this, going from house to house to house, she woke up to the reality of her situation. And she realized that she had to let go. She had to let go. And something had changed in her. So something in her had actually healed. And it had to do with the acceptance of her situation. So the Buddha never claimed to raise anybody from the dead, but his medicine is different. And we talk about the Dharma itself as being medicine. So in this particular story, there is, where the healing comes in, is that there is, first of all, there's a recognition of grief. And if you reflect for a moment on maybe your own relationship with grief, what is it? If you reflect on your own relationship with grief, what does it look like? What are the obstacles to experiencing it? And in our culture as a whole, grief is really suppressed. We don't deal well with it. And it often gets masked as anger. So when I find myself angry, sometimes if I have enough presence of mind, I can ask myself, what's is there some grief underlying this anger? If I can come back to myself and look at the anger and just, what's that? What's underneath that? And oftentimes grief is being masked as anger. It can also be masked as anxiety. High anxiety can mask grief. Confusion, when we feel confused about what we're doing. Depression, these things can mask grief. And the teaching that the teaching of Buddhism, the teaching of Zen, is to, whatever it is that you're experiencing, to really feel what it is. So if you can sort through the layers of feeling, say if it's anger, anxiety, something else there, if you can sort through that and kind of get to the base emotion of the grief. There's one psychoanalyst that I read, Miriam Greenspan. Greenspan, is that? Yeah. And she has a book called The Wisdom of Grief, Fear, and Despair. And she calls these grief, fear, and despair as basic emotions, foundational emotions, out of which you have secondary emotions like anger. And by this I mean basic negative emotions. And negative is not being a problem, but they're negative side of humanity. And they're often masked by things like anger. Anger is a big one. So getting underneath it, and getting underneath the secondary emotion and moving into the primary emotion of grief, and really feeling it, experiencing it. And this may be something that for everybody it needs different support to do this. Some people don't feel comfortable at all grieving in public. Some people feel way more comfortable doing it alone by themselves in privacy. For myself, I notice that I can go for a long period of time without crying, but then all of a sudden, it may be in the middle of a group, I start crying and I have no idea sometimes why. Or sometimes I just feel like overwhelmed with emotion. And I'm not in control of that. It's just that that's the way that I process stuff at times. And it's not I've come to the conclusion that that's not a weakness. It's just a part of my own humanity, my own humanness. But one of the things that when I was living with my teacher, and there were times when I would get sick. So coming back to illness, there were times where I get sick, and my teacher's counsel was from what she heard from Oyama Roshi, her teacher, who said, when you're sick, go and be sick fully, which came from a Zen poet, monk named Ryokan, lived in the 1700s. Go and be sick fully. So if you're sick, completely abandon yourself to illness. And that was very, very freeing. I didn't feel like I had to get better. And when we really abandon hope for wellness, that can often open up doors that we weren't open to before. It can open up a whole pathway to us. So this idea of illness as being something to overcome can sometimes get in the way of our healing process. But if we see sickness as part of a cycle, a natural cycle of us, and grief too, incorporating that grief too as part of a cycle within us, and abandon ourselves completely to it, whatever it is that we're feeling, just open to it. Now we can touch that. It's part of our heart, the soft spot. Kind of Pema Chodron talks about the soft spot. We can get in touch with that. And that's a place of great intimacy with ourselves and with others. To be able to touch that softness within ourselves And to be able to share that with another human being, or just another person, or another, um, doesn't have to be even a person. My teacher shared a kind of intimacy she had with a spider. She saw this spider in the bathroom that she was up in the, like, by the shower, and every morning she'd see it there. And one time she just put her, she said, she was sharing me the story, and I tell you, sometimes I think I could have been in a psychiatric ward when Bushu was being spoken about. But of course, but I would never, that's how it may be taken. Um, but but it was from her heart, and she wasn't crazy. I know it. Where she shared that she just, she put her finger up there, and the spider touched her finger with one of its legs. You know? So, when you're open to your own vulnerability, your own softness, and your own heart mind, we can communicate on another level with not just humans, but other creatures, animals, even insects, bees, just opening up to that possibility. So I want to end with a story of the old lady in China. The old lady in China, and my teacher shared this story many times. This old lady, she was said to be very enlightened by the community that she lived in. And one time she lost a very close relative, and at the funeral ceremony she was crying bitter tears. And one of the members of the village she lived in had the courage to go up to her and say, "We thought you were enlightened." And the old lady turned to her and said, "I'm crying because I'm enlightened." So your grief, your illness, these are not obstacles as far as a Buddhist perspective goes. They're not obstacles to your own freedom of mind. Thank you.